Hey everyone, Tankenstein here. In this video, I'll be reviewing the Saab 105OE. This is a currently 8.3 BR rank 5 premium strike aircraft in the Swedish Air Force's Tech Tree. The OE currently costs 8,560 Golden Eagles when not on sale, and comes with 15 backups. With that said, in this video, I'll be going over everything that you need to know about this strike aircraft, including its stats, how it plays, I'll give its strengths and weaknesses, I'll give you some scores in several key areas, and then I'll give my final recommendation on if I feel this vehicle is worth purchasing or not. With that said, if you like this kind of video, please consider subscribing, but without further ado, let's get into the review. To start, I'll place its stat card here on the side of the screen. Important things to note are its armament, its turn time, and its top speed. Now for how it plays. In short, it's a very weird little aircraft. While it is a strike aircraft, it has very few options for anti-ground ordnance. It also has two AIM-9B missiles at a relatively low BR, making the OE one of the lowest BR aircraft to carry them, though the Seahawks are still currently lower BR and can also carry them. Regardless, because of these AIM-9Bs, the OE's air spawn, being that it is of course a strike aircraft at this rank, and powerful cannons, the OE is essentially an interceptor in Air RB. It's incredibly easy to destroy any bombers that you see on the enemy team, as you can easily reach their altitude and either hit them with cannons or even your missiles. This is likely to be your first role in every match of air battles that you're in. You may be tempted to go after bases, but the OE only carries rockets, and only very few of them, which means that the OE can only destroy a relatively small fraction of a single base. You may also be tempted to immediately go for ground targets at the beginning of a match, but that wastes the opportunity to fly high and score major points by destroying enemy bombers. Once you either destroy said bombers or find that there are just none to be found, you can then boom and zoom with relative impunity. The OE is not very fast and compresses at high speeds, but it is also not incredibly slow, so you should be fine to get a kill or two while ambushing the enemy from above thanks to your air spawn, so long as you somewhat closely monitor your speed to prevent your plane from breaking apart. It is at this point that you can either go after even more enemy planes or go after ground targets and bots. The OE is decently quick, but is still slower than most true fighters at this BR, and also a bit worse in terms of maneuverability versus fighters, so it'd be best to go after distracted enemies while using the OE at low altitudes, as you will rarely if ever win a proper dogfight. It isn't awful in this regard, but it still isn't great. Further, with the AIM-9Bs, you can pretty much only use them against enemies within about 1.5 kilometers or so in front of you, and that are flying straight, as they have poor range and maneuverability, though longer range kills can occasionally happen. Insofar as going after bases is concerned, I would not even attempt it with the OE. 4 of the 6 pylons are already occupied by the two 30mm cannons and 2 AIM-9Bs, and the remaining 2 pylons can only carry a few rockets that will simply slow you down and do negligible damage to bases. Even if you went with a full rocket loadout, you would be totally without offensive armament, which is just a no-go with this vehicle. It is much more efficient to go after either enemy planes, or at very least ground targets, or even a mix of the two. Now for close air support, the Saab 105OE is surprisingly poor for a strike aircraft. It isn't absolutely bad, as the rockets that it can carry are actually quite good, if only few in number, but the OE lacks bombs entirely, which is a huge weakness for a strike aircraft at any BR. If nothing else, the 30mm cannons can be quite effective when strafing, while the RB-05A ATGMs can be amazing so long as you can manually guide them to the target. That's the problem though, as manual guidance can be difficult and may take your attention away from other things, such as enemies firing at you. If you can manage to hit the enemy with your ATGMs, they're typically going to end up being one-shotted pretty much every time at this BR. But that's about the only silver lining for the OE for CAS. Being that it totally lacks all bombs and has such limited ordnance space due to having such few pylons and no rocket pods to consolidate rockets in order to carry more, the OE is simply decent at best at CAS, and it's not really all too great, again barring that you're skilled with manually guided ATGMs launched from planes. If nothing else, the Swedish Air Tech Tree largely lacks good strike aircraft, so the OE counts for something, unless you consider the 105G that has a much more competent loadout, but it is what it is. Now with all that said, let's get into its strengths and weaknesses, and first for its strengths. This vehicle is actually surprisingly durable, being able to survive occasional missile hits. Additionally, being that it has 2 engines, one can be destroyed and the plane can still return to base. Second, it can carry up to 2 RB-24 air-to-air battles. Though they are essentially just AIM-9Bs, which are notoriously mediocre, they will still result in a surprising amount of kills, especially against either unmaneuverable aircraft like bombers or people who just aren't paying attention. For its third strength, it has very powerful 30mm cannons that can destroy both air and ground targets with ease, though these are only optional as the 105OE lacks built-in cannons of any kind. Fourth, it has an air spawn and ARB, which means that it can hunt bombers fairly easily at the start of a match, and then engage fighters while having an altitude advantage. For its 5th strength, it has a good roll rate. For its 6th strength, it can carry up to 2 RB-05A ATGMs. While these are manually guided, they can be devastating in ground battles. And finally, it carries premium RP and SL bonuses. Now for its weaknesses. It has extremely short landing gears that can make landing more challenging than it ought to be. For its 2nd weakness, flaps break easily at relatively low speeds. 3rd, compression occurs a bit below 1,000 km per hour, which sometimes mean that diving will result in loss of controls, unless of course you use your air brakes. 4th, top speed is somewhat low for this BR at only 947 km per hour, though its structural speed limit is thankfully a bit higher. For its 5th weakness, engines easily overheat when at full throttle. 6th, when carrying just its 30mm cannons and 2 missiles, which is most likely going to be your typical air battle loadout, the performance of the 105OE, specifically the climb rate, is noticeably mediocre at this BR. Beyond this, maneuverability, while not terrible for a strike aircraft, is somewhat mediocre relative to fighters, which can mean that you will struggle when fighting against them. Thankfully, it's still workable, but it is definitely a weakness. For its 8th weakness, it has a fairly small ordnance load that it can carry versus ground targets. And finally, it totally lacks bombs, which is absolutely crazy for strike aircraft. And as I said before, it even lacks rocket pods, which is also kinda crazy. Though, if nothing else, not totally unexpected. Now with that said, let's get into how I score this aircraft. And first, for dogfighting and ARB, I give it a 6 out of 10. Surprisingly, the 105OE is actually quite decent in air battles, though this is largely due to 2 factors. First, and the most important thing, it gets an air spawn. This helps out tremendously. It also helps that it starts off with a fairly high speed and has a surprisingly good amount of acceleration at altitude. Second, it has access to up to 2 AIM-9B missiles and 2 very good 30mm cannons. This all means that the OE can be surprisingly effective in air battles, especially versus larger aircraft like bombers and the occasional strike aircraft. Aside from this though, and the OE loses a bit of its luster. It isn't bad when it's at low altitude and lacks missiles, but it is noticeably not as good. It's basically that the longer the match goes on, the less effective the OE tends to be, as matches tend to draw to lower altitudes and exhaust their speed at this BR. The maneuverability, while not terrible, will not be as good as most fighters, so you pretty much always need to take advantage of your high altitude at the beginning of a match in order to destroy bombers, then boom and zoom on more agile enemies and hopefully run away. If you do this, the OE is actually quite good. Otherwise, if you play it like a fighter, you're probably going to have a bad time. Now with that said, for close air support, I give it a 4.5 out of 10. I'll just start this off by saying that the close air support of the OE would be much worse if not for the fairly good 30mm cannons and of course the inclusion of ATGMs, even if they are only manually guided. The rockets are fine, especially the M56D and even the M4956 rockets, but you can only carry up to 12 of the M56D and only 6 of the M49 rockets, and that's if you totally go without any other armament. One of the biggest faults of this aircraft is the limited ordnance space that it has, as well as its total lack of ordnance that could improve this space issue, such as rocket pods. Regardless, the Saab 105OE is certainly capable for close air support, but it lacks bombs, which will throw a lot of people off, and only has access to manually guided ATGMs and a small supply of rockets, on top of course, optional 30mm cannons. To me, that just isn't enough, especially for a strike aircraft. I'm sure some people will say that the OE is easily a 6 out of 10 or higher for CAS, largely due to its ATGMs, but not me. Now overall, I'll give it a 5 out of 10. On one hand, I surprisingly love this vehicle, whereas on the other hand, I feel that its main role, which is being a strike aircraft, is a letdown. I think I really just like the OE for its air spawn, its missiles, and decent enough performance, as they can allow you to do quite well in air battles. Otherwise, the OE feels like a very niche strike aircraft that some people will absolutely love, while other people will likely absolutely hate it. I personally enjoy it quite a bit for air battles and find it mostly usable in ground battles, but you want something more out of a strike aircraft in terms of CAS at this BR. At least for me, I mean, as I admittedly am a scrub when it comes to manually guided missiles. If you like manually guided missiles, however, you might absolutely love this vehicle, so look at my review through that lens. Also, as always, try it out in test drive mode to see if you like it before you decide to buy it. Now with that said, do I recommend the Saab 105OE for purchase? As is the case with so many vehicles in this game, this recommendation isn't so clear cut. In general, I do not recommend it for purchase, as it's a strike aircraft with a very specific set of anti-ground weapons that will only suit a limited number of players. While it is very fun in air battles, largely again due to its air spawn and low BR AIM-9 missiles, this is a fairly flimsy reason to purchase the 105OE. I feel that the premium Seahawks and the German and French Air Force's tech trees are better than the Saab 105OE, relative to BR at least, and also have two AIM-9Bs and an even lower BR. Heck, they even have access to bombs. I say the only reason to purchase the Saab 105OE is if you're absolutely in love with the idea of intercepting the few bombers that you see at this BR with missiles, and if you're good with RB-05A ATGMs and it's on sale. That's pretty much the only time I would recommend it. Truthfully, the 105OE is just a very niche vehicle with limited capabilities that won't jive with the preferences and playstyles of a lot of players, especially for close air support. Instead, I would recommend the A32A Road Adam for purchase if you want a more versatile aircraft, as it has a better armament, is easier to use, and has more numerous ground weapons, ballistic computers, and is a higher rank, which means that it can research more of the Swedish Air Force's tech tree without receiving an RP penalty. Sure, the Rotterdam is slightly blander, but it is fairly effective in both ground battles and air battles, which makes it into a reliable and versatile workhorse. Regardless, I do not give the Saab 105OE a general recommendation for purchase, nor do I give it my Tankenstein seal of approval. This is a weird plane, and is probably the biggest bane of bombers at this BR, but there are currently very few bombers at this BR to fight, and once you take that away, the OE feels a little bit stale, especially if you play in ground battles and this strike aircraft just doesn't strike incredibly well unless you're good with manually guided ATGMs. Now with all that being said, thank you so much for watching. If you don't mind, please consider subscribing to my channel, liking this video, and also of course commenting on this video with what you think of the 105OE and also what you think of this review. Either way, thanks so much again, and I'll see you all on the other side. Take care everyone.